Latin America. The Latin Americans are some of the chillest, hardworking individuals I have ever met, but I've never understood why they are so afraid of ice. In the early 1800s, during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon invaded Spain, and they did not take it well. The Spanish colonies took the opportunity during that time to gain independence from Spain, eventually leading to the creation of all the different countries that exist in Latin America today. During this time, there's one young revolutionary, Simon Bolivar, known as El Liberated, who fought for a dream to unify Latin America. After Napoleon's invasion of Spain, the Latin American Wars of Independence began and lasted between 1808 to 1826, where hundreds of thousands of lives were lost. During the beginning of the Latin American Wars of Independence, the revolts were unorganized and had many internal divisions, but then revolutions eventually gained speed under the leadership of Simon Bolivar, becoming El Liberated. El Liberated fought for some of the Enlightenment values that he was exposed to during his marriage before he lost his wife in 1803. A few years later, he returned to his homeland and first started fighting in 1810 as a militia officer, participating in the early stages of the Venezuelan War of Independence. He then fought for the First and Second Venezuelan Republics and the United Provinces of New Granada, but eventually Spanish forces subdued New Granada, forcing Bolivar into exile in Jamaica. Eventually, Bolivar returned to lead several successful military campaigns and established a government in Bogota and Carabobo in 1821, which led to the liberation of Venezuela. He also liberated Ecuador, Peru, and Upper Peru, which was later renamed Bolivia in his honor. Because of his efforts, most of the Latin American countries were able to gain independence, but his vision was not just for the Latin American colonies to just gain independence from Spain, but to unite into a single country. His plan first came into fruition with the establishment of Gran Colombia in 1821. He understood, though, that uniting all Latin America would be basically impossible due to the technology of the time, along with all the divisions between all the newly independent countries, both internally and externally. But there was always a small hope of the long shot of creating a unified Latin American country, which he tried to make come into fruition in the Congress of Panama in 1826. The goal of the Congress was to establish a framework to eventually lead to the unification of the Latin American countries, however it ended in complete failure, with no one signing the Treaty of Union, League, and Perpetual Confederation other than Gran Colombia itself, because of regional rivalries and because a lot of the countries who were invited did not even attend the Congress. Then in 1831, just a few years later, Gran Colombia collapsed, along with the dream of uniting Latin America. But what if things went differently than in our timeline? What if Simon Bolivar united Latin America upon its independence? We will first have to find a new way to govern Gran Colombia in a more decentralized way before unifying Latin America if the union is to even stand a chance. This is because of all the various different ethnicities within all of Latin America that need to be addressed, combined with the large amount of territory that would need to be governed, which just simply cannot happen with the centralized government. Bolivar, however, has seen nothing but chaos from decentralization, and even blamed it for all the chaos that happened during his rule on Gran Colombia. Throughout the Wars of Independence, he has witnessed regions fall into civil war and absolute chaos because of tensions between different classes and ethnicities. He has also witnessed the unfortunate fact that unlike with the Americans, the Latin Americans simply were not ready for liberty, which is a fact that I completely agree with. Bolivar was able to be exposed to way more enlightenist ideas of thinking compared to most Latin Americans during his time in Europe. So although he agreed with democracy and freedom and many other enlightenist values and admired strong enlightened rulers like George Washington, the Latin Americans just simply weren't exposed to those ideas and concepts like a lot of the Europeans and the Americans were. So here, we have to get creative with things. We can't have Bolivar implement a system similar to the Americans or the Europeans, but we need to have a way for Gran Colombia to be decentralized enough to properly govern everyone, while also preventing total chaos from happening, while also enlightening the people so that they will have the democratic ideals needed for a democracy to work. That is a really important fact about democracy that the Americans have forgotten in recent years. The first thing Bolivar would have to do is structure Gran Colombia into a federation of autonomous republics that will all have the rights to their local cultural autonomy and way of life. However, everyone would have to submit to a central authority on military, foreign policy, and trade, along with a national parliament that would ensure the representation of all the ethnic regions in Gran Colombia. A Council of Nations would also need to be established to get rid of distrust between different ethnicities to prevent infighting, where representatives could advise the national parliament about their issues, which could be brought up in parliament. Bolivar could still be a dictator for life if he wanted to, but with extra steps in order to ensure that democracy eventually happens. First of all, we will give him emergency powers that are able to override the national parliament for his reign, to prevent infighting while still being able to give representation to ethnic groups. Next, instead of having a similar system to a constitutional monarchy where he picks a successor after he dies, an electoral system could then be implemented where leaders will have to serve a 20-year long term before an election could happen again, which could later be reduced to 5 years if they wanted to. And then, throughout his presidency, he can slowly introduce more enlightened values into Gran Colombia and later the rest of Latin America through the education system, which will be redone to teach kids enlightenist values while also teaching non-Spanish citizens Spanish, like how English Canadians are taught French Canadian and vice versa in my country. By the time all of the kids grow up, they would have been exposed to enlightenist ideas that they could spread to their families throughout their childhood, which will eventually lead to people being ready for liberty over time. With all that out of the way, we'll say that Bolivar came up with those ideas over the course of the revolution, and while forming Gran Colombia in 1819, he would implement those ideas while forming the country, and we are now left with a more stable Gran Colombia that will eventually be ready to unite with the rest of Latin America. After an alternate Gran Colombia is formed, things wouldn't be completely smooth sailing at first, but it would be much better than our timeline theoretically. Up until the Congress, Simon would focus internally to manage the stability of his own country, as well as helping to liberate Peru and Bolivia. In our timeline, after liberating Peru and Bolivia, he became their conditional president, stretching him thin between 3 different countries, and on top of that, him being in control of Peru and Bolivia didn't sit right with the people and their politicians who saw him as a foreign strongman and feared that he would outright annex them into Gran Colombia. In this alternate timeline though, he would instead install other local rulers that would be loyal to him, kind of making Peru and Bolivia puppet kingdoms in order to appease their people. He would then oversee the creation and implementation of his new system into Peru and Bolivia to make them more stable, and would also create an alliance pact with Peru and Bolivia with the military aspect of it, where Gran Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia would defend each other from external threats, with an attack on one is an attack on all rule, like NATO, as well as helping each other out with potential internal uprisings that could arise because of the instability that all the newly independent countries would still have in order to prevent potential civil wars. There would also be an economic factor to the treaty, where they won't tariff each other, but only countries outside of their pact, and it would promote free trade between the 3 countries, as well as future infrastructure projects and good relations between the 3 countries. Now, instead of having one big Congress where everyone signs to join the treaty, which Bolivar attempted to do in the Congress of Panama in our timeline, we will instead just have Gran Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia focus on themselves and integrate with each other more, making a unified currency, a unified military structure, and free border movement initiatives, and many more over the course of the next couple of decades. It would be kind of like the EU initiatives, where you join the EU, but there's a bunch of different initiatives that you can join over time, like the Eurozone and the Schengen Pact, and so on and so forth. Anyways, during that time in 1830, Simon Bolivar died, which would still happen in this timeline, but in this timeline, there would be a democratic election. The best candidate to win, in my opinion, would be Francisco de Paula Santar, who was a key figure during the Latin American Wars of Independence, as well as Simon Bolivar's vice president in Gran Colombia. He also believed in Pan-Latin Americanism like Simon Bolivar did, so we would just assume that before Simon Bolivar dies, he endorses Francisco to be the next president of Gran Colombia. With the endorsement combined with his popularity already for helping liberate Gran Colombia aside Simon Bolivar, I could easily see him being elected into power, which would be a 20-year long term, which would be cut short by his death in 1840. During Francisco's term, he would finish stabilizing Gran Colombia, while Peru and Colombia would also be stabilizing more after the revolution. By 1839, Gran Colombia would have been independent for 20 years instead of collapsing soon after Bolivar died in our timeline, and Enlightenism and Pan-Latin American ideals would have spread across Gran Colombia, Bolivia, Peru, and to an extent, other Latin American countries as well. Over in Mexico, the Confederates would begin to expand their influence there in order to stabilize Mexico and gain another ally and country to eventually unite with. The best time to intervene would be during the Revolt of 1832. The revolts were between the Federalists, who wanted a decentralized government, and the Centralists, who wanted a centralized government, which ended in centralist victory. By this point, Gran Colombia, along with Bolivia and Peru to an extent, would have proven that their way of government is the best way of governing, and a lot of them would most likely support that system. The Confederacy countries would then support the pro-Confederacy Federalists and send them military aid and even troops on the ground if needed in order to topple their government and install a new government with a local leader that would be loyal to Gran Colombia. They would then install a system of governance that all the Confederacy countries started out with, therefore expanding their influence and preventing the Texas Revolution, which led to the Mexican-American War. Towards the end of the 1830s, they would then receive membership as a member of the Confederates and integrate into the Confederacy more over time. In 1839, the Federal Republic of Central America began its civil war because the people wanted more autonomy, which resulted in its collapse in our timeline. In this timeline, they would basically do the same thing they did with Mexico and support the pro-Confederate Federalists, resulting in another pro-Confederate country being installed and eventually integrated. In America, Manifest Destiny fever would be running rampant across America, which they took out on Mexico because they were destabilized and the weakest target at the time, and they also wanted to expand out to the West Coast. Also during this time, Britain and America had a border dispute in the Oregon Territory, which the USA lost a lot of focus from during the Mexican-American War, and Britain didn't want to fight a major war all the way out in the Oregon Territory. So eventually, the dispute was solved diplomatically. In this timeline, however, the Manifest Destiny fever would have to go somewhere, and America's options would be to double down on Texas and fight against a united Latin American Confederacy army, or against Britain, who is halfway across the world, so it's not at all out of the possibility that a war would break up between America and Britain towards the end of the 1840s. America would obviously be the aggressor, and would probably come up with a dumb reason like a pig being killed or something to justify starting a war with Britain. They already had a lot of American settlers in the Oregon Territory by this point, so they would quickly militarily occupy those regions and start to push further north, and with America being able to supply troops in the battlefield a million times faster than Britain is able to, they would eventually give up and surrender. And in the peace treaty, the Americans would fully annex Oregon and would potentially compensate Britain with some money like they did with Mexico to further convince them to surrender. After that, with the Oregon Territory being annexed by the Americans, the rest of Ruperts Land would basically become a useless liability to the Britons. The only reason why Britain settled modern-day Western Canada, which they did really sparsely, which remains so to this day, was so that eventually, when it would become united into a dominion, it would have access to the West Coast, which they would no longer have access to anymore. So in order to keep Ruperts Land, which is now basically a useless territory, they would have to deal with setting up defenses all across Western Canada, only to have an East Coast that would be sparsely populated because it's too cold, which not a lot of Canadians even live in today, going off population density, and then potentially fight against the Americans in a fourth war, which would probably result in them losing the territory. If you're in charge of Britain, would you really want to go through all that effort and pay for all that money for colonies that you don't even really care about and weren't even that profitable before having to militarily defend them all from the Americans? So yeah, I'd say within a decade after the war, Britain would sell all the undeveloped Ruperts Land territory to the USA, which would then go on to claim the rest of the unclaimed parts of North America like Britain did in the 1860s in our timeline. As for the rest of Britain's colonies, in modern-day Eastern Canada, I could see them just keeping them the same in Ontario and Quebec, but creating a third new colony uniting the English-speaking Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland sometime in the future, because there wouldn't really be a point of creating a united Canadian Dominion anymore when the English and the French Canadian populations would now be even more equal. So it would just be an even worse mess than what happened in Canada in the 90s, which Britain would definitely not want to deal with, nor would the colonists. Moving back to Latin America, which is all you guys care about, unless if you're American or Canadian. If you're Canadian, half of you would be calling me a traitor in the comments section, and half of you would wish you were living in this timeline at this point. I'm sorry, I don't make the scenarios, I just make the scenarios. Anyways, over the course of those 2 decades, many events of expansion would take place, so I'll just go from country to country. Uruguay would be facing threats from Brazil and Argentina, and would most likely turn to the Confederation countries for protection and reform, and join the Confederation by the late 1840s. Paraguay would be isolationist and nationalist like in our timeline. However, in our timeline during 1840, after the death of their leader, there was a brief succession crisis that the Confederacy could exploit to launch a coup and install a Confederacy puppet, and then deal with the rebels, and eventually they would join the Confederacy when it stabilizes more. Chile, by the 1840s, would be stable and would start to become a regional naval power. However, would most likely be wary of the Confederation's influence across Latin America, like they were with the Peru-Bolivian Confederation after they united in our timeline, which resulted in a war being fought between them, resulting in the collapse of Peru-Bolivia. In this timeline, however, it would already be too late, and just like America, they wouldn't want to declare war on them because they're too powerful. Most likely, what we could see is Chile seeing the benefits of working with the Confederate countries and signing trade deals with them and stuff like that, and eventually as time goes on, the Chileans would want to become an official member of the Confederacy so as to not be isolated from the rest of Latin America as other countries join. Over in Argentina, there would be in a similar situation that Mexico and Central America were in, and there would be in a state of civil war between the Centralists and the Federalists. So the Confederacy would support pro-Confederation Federalists, and by 1855, a pro-Confederation country would be installed which would reform and join the Confederacy by the early 1860s. Most importantly of all, the core 3 territories of the Confederation have fully democratized, maybe even into a slightly different system than the Americans have that's much more similar to the early versions of the constitutional monarchs, where the monarch, or in our case the president, would have a lot of power and would make decisions like a dictator would, but there would be a parliament that would keep the president in check to make sure the people have representation in the government. That way, decisions could be made quicker, but the people could still have representation and counteract those decisions if they would like to, and if the Constitution would prevent the Parliament and the President from seizing more power, and the President would be democratically elected and could serve up to a 20-year term, but the people would have the power to impeach them throughout the Parliament. The core 3 territories would also be much more integrated logistically than before, and thus, transportation flows around much more freely. After an election, all 3 of the core members vote to officially unify into the Federal Republic of Colombia, or the FRC. This is celebrated across all of the Latin American people who support Pan-Latinism, except for Brazil, which would have rising tensions between them and the Confederate countries. The USA probably wouldn't really have any negative reaction to them, but if they do, it wouldn't really matter because during the American Civil War, they would have a way easier time putting it down because they would have less slave states, and the Confederates by this point would have naturally abolished slavery over time and would be against it. Wait a minute. The Confederacy, that doesn't sound right. I didn't pick a good name for that economic union. But if you close your eyes, does it almost feel like nothing changed at all? Anyways, in order to promote good relations with America, they would supply troops to put out the rebellion, reunifying America much quicker than in our timeline. Moving on to Brazil, and over the last few decades, the Republican movement, which was already strong within the military by this point in our timeline, would be even stronger because of the success and influence of the Confederate countries. As a result, in the late 1870s, Brazil's monarchy would fall a little bit earlier than it did in our timeline, and a pro-Confederate country would come out of it that would also reform and join the Confederacy in the 1880s. The last main expansion that would be made would be an alternate Spanish-American War, only this time it would happen earlier and it would be between the Confederate countries and Spain. Before this, the DRC and Haiti would have eventually, through the influence they have gained, will spark revolutions in the Philippines, Cuba, and the rest of the Spanish Caribbean islands, and just like the USA, they would absolutely destroy them. In the peace treaty, Cuba and the Philippines are liberated, installed with pro-Confederate governments, and will eventually join. And just like that, the Spanish Empire officially ends, ironically enough, by what once was their empire. Now that the Confederacy has officially expanded to all the countries in Latin America, it will now focus on consolidating its sphere of influence. First, some of the smaller countries like Central America, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Chile would join the Union. Next would be Mexico, who would have had a lot of people from the FRC settled in northern parts of Mexico during the gold rush, and Argentina. Then, by the beginning of the 20th century, the Philippines, Cuba, and the rest of the Spanish Caribbean islands would join the Union, with it just being Brazil that the FRC left in the Confederacy. With it just being Brazil and the FRC left in the Confederacy, they were officially disbanded, but Brazil and the FRC will still have the same economic, political, and military integrations as before, but just under a mutual partnership as opposed to a continental confederacy format. By the time World War I begins, the FRC would finally be united, except for Brazil, and they would all most likely be isolationist like the USA, and would probably side with the Entente with the Americans, and just sell them a bunch of weapons and collect all the debt later. The two biggest changes of World War I would be there wouldn't be a united Canadian Dominion fighting. Instead, we would just have the Ontarian Dominion, the Quebecan Dominion, and the whatever the hell you want to call this thing Dominion. Hell, for all we know, they might not even be dominions by this point. They might be basically fully independent because they'd be almost as useless as Canada is now. I'm gonna tick off a lot of Canadians with that comment. One thing is for certain though, there would be a few less war crimes and a few less rules on the Geneva Convention. Only true Canadians would understand that reference. The next big change would be that the FRC would supply money and military equipment to the war effort, and because of that, America probably wouldn't even bother getting involved towards the end of the war, and with that extra aid, they could probably finish the war around the same time they did in our timeline with no military intervention from the USA or the FRC. In World War II, things would be similar to World War I. They would still be isolationist, but supply the Allies, and the British would be able to fight a better resistance during the Battle of Britain, and the Soviets would be better supplied, and thus the no-no Germans would lose quickly. The FRC probably wouldn't have made a deal with the British to pay off a lot of their debt in exchange for a lot of North American colonies, either after World War I or during World War II, which would then be annexed. The Colombians would also hold on to French Guiana and Dutch Guiana, like America did with Greenland in our timeline during World War II, after Germany occupies Western Europe. What would be really interesting is Pearl Harbor, because the reason why the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor was because they needed to expand it into the South Pacific to take their resources to use against the Chinese, but the USA had influence in that region because of Hawaii and the Philippines. However, in this timeline, the Philippines would be under Colombia's control, not America's. In order to transport naval ships to defend the Philippines, they would most likely use Pearl Harbor, meaning the Japanese would have to attack the Americans and the Colombians at the same time, as well as their naval bases in the Philippines in a coordinated attack in order to do what needs to be done. So yeah, that wouldn't end well. A joint FRC and American nuclear bomb would most likely be made and dropped on Japan. In fact, they probably wouldn't be able to run over the Philippines and therefore the rest of the South Pacific like they did in our timeline, because the Philippines would probably be defended a lot better than the Americans defended it, because it would be an actual state in the Union as opposed to just a colony, which it was to the Americans. And for the rest of the war, they may just do a divide and conquer strategy, with the Americans mainly fighting in Europe, and then the Colombians fighting in the Pacific, defending the Philippines, and then conquering Taiwan, as in all these southern Japanese islands over here. In the peace treaty, everything would be the same in Europe. as both fronts would have gotten an equal boost of equipment from the FRC, but what would be different would be the South Pacific. In that peace treaty, the FRC would annex Taiwan and the Ryukyu's island chain in order to keep an eye on Japan, and they would also pay for French and Dutch Guiana to be annexed into their country. Moving on to the Cold War, and the first major change that I could see would be the FRC supporting the Chinese nationalists during the Chinese Civil War directly to ensure that communism doesn't spread into all of China. This would most likely result in a stalemate happening, and China being split along the Yangtze River into a northern communist regime that would become a Soviet puppet, and the southern regime that would be aligned with the FRC. From there, North and South China would expand westward and with support from the Soviets and the FRC. From there, with northern China being much more dependent on the Soviets than they were in our timeline, they will fall into line more and eventually become a satellite state, and unite with Mongolia and Xinjiang to form a more united North China state. South China would most likely adopt the system that the FRC used with all the Latin American countries and ensure that they end up establishing their version of a democratic government, which would appeal much more to the Chinese than the Americans' version of democracy. As a result of that, with the weaker communist China, South Vietnam would take over North Vietnam in the Vietnam War, and South Korea would win the Korean War, with the FRC supporting them. During decolonization, which the former great powers would have much more pressure to do, now that there are three superpowers, I could see the FRC caring much more about how the decolonization process is done compared to America and the Soviet Union in our timeline, because unlike in America, they have experience in their history what happens when you don't decolonize properly, and would want to prevent all that from happening, and would thus work with the former great powers to decolonize properly. I went into a scenario about how Africa would decolonize properly in another video if you'd like to watch it, link will be in the description below. However, although Africa would be much better off than in our timeline, in the scenario I created, it's not a perfect scenario, and I made a couple of dumb mistakes, and I might redo that video one day, but in the meantime, here's a more accurate map. The FRC would have prop up these newly independent countries in Asia to establish its own sphere of influence in East Asia, possibly establishing a military alliance like NATO or joining NATO and having it expand into the South Pacific. With the care that they have put into ensuring the proper decolonization of Africa, the FRC would also have soft power all over the African countries as well. One last change I would like to make with the Cold War would be that with the United Indian Peninsula, because of the FRC's pressure for the British to decolonize properly, the Soviet Union would be able to conquer all of Afghanistan because they would still be neutral in this timeline. However, the Soviet Union would still end up collapsing despite winning the Afghanistan war. Also, at some point during the Cold War, Brazil could join the FRC, truly uniting all of Latin America. The modern day would be completely unrecognizable. There would have been no war on terror, and the Americans' love for oil would be quenched because they would have all the oil they need from the conquered territories of Canada. Mass immigration and the border crisis wouldn't be a thing because in this timeline, the cartels are much less significant, like the KKK, and the Latin Americans are not afraid of ICE. Trump probably wouldn't have gone into politics without the border crisis, and if he did, his second term would be a lot different. There would be no movement to annex Canada because all that's left of them is this, which wouldn't do anything for America. There wouldn't really be a movement to annex Greenland because you have everything you need with your Canadian territories, and you wouldn't want to annex the Panama Canal because America would never have built or controlled it, and it would start a third world war. I could see, however, America and the FRC slowly pull away from their roles as the international policemen of the world, as it would become a much more stable place to live in than in our timeline. And with that, I think it's a perfect note to end this scenario on. Thank you all for watching the video and for all your support in the What If Everything Were Perfect for the Roman Empire series. We have now tripled in the amount of subscribers that we had previously, which is really exciting for me and the future growth of the channel. As a thank you, I have noticed that a lot of you guys are interested in seeing a What If Everything Were Perfect for Ireland video, so I think I might make that. And also, I've developed a new editing style during this video, which will make it much more easier for me to continue on the What If Mars Was Habitable series that I'm gonna try out, so hopefully everything goes well and I can revive this series. But anyways, I hope you liked the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe and turn on notifications. And don't get anyone pregnant, but if you do, make sure they're hot. And I'll see you all in the next video.